We have spent a fair amount of time in the southern half of the peninsula looking at the Arab Jewish or the Muslim Jewish period of coexistence, the famous La Convivencia, right? And now we're going to look at the northern half and at the later part of the Middle Ages, specifically the 12th to the 15th century, which will unfortunately culminate in the Inquisition and the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. This is going to be kind of like the seam of medieval Jewish history for this course. It's not an uncommon place to sort of draw a line and indicate that before this event of 1492, things were one way, and then after 1492, they were rather different. I think you can say the same thing in the 20th century about the Holocaust and the state of Israel. Things were certainly different before those two events, so closely related in time, and then after those two events. So that's why we're going to construct much of the next semester on the post-expulsion era. So here's a map that will give you a sense of what we're talking about. This is the Reconquista, the reconquest. You'll recall that the Muslims come up from North Africa and they take over the peninsula primarily in the southern region, and they make it pretty much to the very top of the peninsula, but then it doesn't take long before the northern area starts to recede back into Christian lands, and slowly the Christians are able to penetrate downward, and eventually they will ultimately expel the Jews and the Muslims from the entire peninsula. But we're going to focus on the regions of Leon, Castilla, Aragon, Navarre over the course of the next hour. Now, there's a few really interesting phenomena that are going on at this time. First, this is the era of the greatest of the Spanish court Jews. This is an institution which we'll see examples of it throughout Europe, but Spain in many ways has some of the greatest examples. Court Jews, it's hard to really translate that appropriately. It's related to the idea of being in the king's court, like a courtier is sometimes, you see that word. It's something like a lobbyist or sometimes a government official, typically associated with some kind of fiscal activity. They often don't have any specific role in the court, but they're very much part of the ruling circle, advising kings, very frequently underwriting the king's activities, and exercising a tremendous amount of power. Quite often, these courtiers are also the titular heads of the Jewish community, so chosen because they are so close to the levers of power and are able to protect the community appropriately in that way. But quite often they are heavily resented by the larger non-Jewish population, and sometimes they suffer terrible falls from grace because they're intimately associated with the king that they serve. We see this, for example, with the great Don Isaac Abarbanel, or Abravanel, who of course was exiled from Portugal, and then later he would be exiled from Castile, from Spain as a whole, and spent the last few years of his life wandering around. And it's really amazing, remarkable that he accomplished so much literary material when he was in exile from these places. But he's a good example of a Spanish court Jew, and the Spanish Jewish communities in Catholic northern Spain actually had phenomenal levels of authority, partially because of the tremendous strength of their courtiers. In particular, in Castile and in Aragon, the Jewish leadership was very much involved in an institution called tax farming, which we have discussed briefly in other classes, but let us just quickly recall what we're talking about here. Tax farming is a typical medieval institution where the king is unable to actually tax every individual landowner or certainly not peasants in his kingdom. So what he does is he deals with entire communities as a whole, typically whole classes of people in particular regions, and he hires out sort of middlemen to take care of the actual collection of taxes. These are called tax farmers because if the king assesses, for example, that from one particular region he can acquire, let's say, 100 gold coins, then he will appoint a middleman who is typically a Jew who will go out there and using a network of employees, typically also Jewish, they will be in charge of doing the actual collection of the taxes, the assessing of the properties, the assessing of the agricultural output, the placing of tolls on bridges and various small taxes with the authority of the king. And the tax farmer will collect maybe 1,200 gold coins. The 1,000 will be remitted to the king, and the 200 will be the profit for engaging in tax farming. So an extremely important venture that the king values very highly, and the kings, as we shall see, tended to protect the Jewish population primarily because they were a very valuable kind of way to derive funds from the population. One historian has put it as kind of like the Jews are like a sponge that the king puts on a stick and dips into the ocean of the peasantry and then draws it out and is able to squeeze the liquid out of the sponge. And so the Jews were often placed in that position. Naturally, Jews are involved in all kinds of other activities in Spain. They are landowners. Again, there's this widespread misconception that Jews were not allowed to own land. That is something that is true in some places and times, but typically not true. Jews were able to own land. It was just not necessarily a wise thing for Jews to invest in land because if there was an expulsion, then you lost all of your wealth. Jews were also involved in various trades and various crafts. Silversmithing and goldsmithing was very common. They often faced competition from local guilds, however, particularly in Northern Europe, and they often were not able to join monopolies in given towns. So things like tax farming and money lending tended to be the economic backbone of these Jewish communities, but not at all the exclusive source of income. But when you combine their role as powerful courtiers and as being extremely important in the collection of taxes, they actually become fairly secure, apparently, for that time and place. This meant that it was remarkable the degree to which the Jewish communities in northern Spain had autonomy over their own affairs. This is something that we have seen when we talked about Jewish communal structure, but maybe I should emphasize it a little bit more here, that typically when Jews arrived in a particular place, they were granted a charter by the ruling authorities. Sometimes this is called Magdeburgrecht or Magdeburg rights after a town in Europe. But the essential idea is the king or the nobleman in some cases would grant to the Jews of a given location, all right, you're moving in here, your community has the right to do this, to do that, things like build a wall around your community if you like, to engage in certain trades, but not necessarily in other trades. And this charter was intended as a guarantee of rights for the community. And it was basically observed until it was finally broken, typically with an expulsion or revolutions or things like that. So the level of autonomy that the Jews had in northern Spain from the 1200s till the 1400s was really incredible. Jews, for example, were of course allowed to hold their own courts by Talmudic law, the Beit Din. This was not unexceptional. But in many of these Spanish communities, if there was a dispute between a Jew and a Christian, the Christian had to submit to the Jewish court, which is rather unusual. And in some exceptional cases, the king not only granted the Jews the right to administer corporal punishment, which was an effective technique of controlling populations, but also, in some rare cases, to even impose capital punishment. That's an incredible thing. The circumstances under which a community would legally through the Beit Din impose capital punishment is very, very rare and exceptional and controversial. But nevertheless, this gives you a sense of the very high degree of autonomy that the Jews had in Catholic Spain from 1200 till about 1400. It was really it's not a golden era in the same way that the southern part of the peninsula was regarded as a golden era. You don't have quite the same kind of like cultural synthesis that you see between Arabic and Hebraic culture, but nevertheless, it was a period of tremendous power for the Jewish community and general wealth. This is especially true during the reign of James I of Aragon, shown here, who was a remarkably strong protector of the Jews, even when some of the elements of their economic might began to wane. And I'm going to explain how that happened shortly. But we'll return to James I in just a moment when we talk about the Barcelona Disputation, which is right now. So when one of the great power struggles that tends to be revealed throughout much of the Middle Ages is the power struggle between the temporal powers, meaning the king, and the religious powers, the church, and specifically the Catholic Church. As we discussed when we looked on Jewish communal structure, like who really should be in charge? You know, philosophically, you would think maybe the religious spiritual authority should be in charge, but on the other hand, there's a lot of nasty business involved in governing. There's a lot of patronage, and nepotism, for example, is a word actually that comes from the medieval church. It means nephew, because you would promote, a pope would promote his nephew, quote unquote, even though it was actually his son. And so this is like a term that we've borrowed for contemporary parlance to speak about, administrative corruption. But the king really had the actual power, had the soldiers and so on. So the king and the church often had kind of like a seesaw relationship where when the power of the king went down, the churches went up, and vice versa. And so as we see with James I of Aragon, there was a moment where he had to accede to demands of the clergy, who were, very upset about the power that had been given to Jews in Spain. And so he agreed to allow a disputation to take place in Barcelona in the year 1263. Disputations would garner a tremendous amount of interest in the 13th and 14th centuries. These were kind of like big intellectual pageants where Jews were forced to participate in debates over central tenets of Judaism and, in fact, Christianity. Now, it was impossible for Jews to win these kinds of debates. They were really more like show trials that were intended to demonstrate the validity of Christianity and to encourage, sometimes coerce, Jews to convert. The Christian side was typically headed up by a Jewish convert to Christianity who had like inside knowledge of what Judaism really believed and had greater textual skills with Hebrew, possibly Aramaic, and so on. And so the Barcelona Disputation was in that character. It was one of the earlier disputations. On the Christian side was I believe his name was Pablo de Christiani, if I remember correctly, a convert to Christianity, but not an especially, well-regarded intellectual. In fact, he kind of bungled much of the Christian side of this debate. And on the other side, James I allowed the Jewish community to appoint their leader, who was, a figure of tremendous consequence, the incredible Rabbi Moshe Ben Nachmann, also known as Nachmanides, right? Like Maimonides is known, Moses, the son of Maimon. So this is Moses, the son of Nachman, hence Nachmanides, who was actually, a thinker of tremendous depth, who had published a lot of work that is still studied avidly to this day. And although he was, older, he was in his 60s at the time that he was approached for this particular task, he agreed to do it. He was on good terms with James I of Aragon. He agreed to do it on the condition that he be allowed to speak freely. This was an exception that was not granted in other disputations, but James I, who had some kind of genuine intellectual curiosity about how this would work out, granted him the right to speak freely, indicating that he would be free to say whatever he wanted in this disputation. And so it was convened, as I mentioned, in the year 1263 over a period of some days. And we have actually remarkably both the Christian and the Jewish versions of the debate in print. The Christian side recorded their assessment of the transcripts, and the Jewish side, by none other than Nachmanides himself, recorded the proceedings. They don't always gel together. The end result is, of course, that the Christian side won, as would be expected, and this was a public spectacle which had, the king and queen and all kinds of important figures watching this debate. But Nachmanides really, he made very light work of his opponent. The Christian side the Catholic side was actually on its back foot right from the very beginning, because Nachmanides argued that the Jesus that the Christian side was referring to was not the same Jesus as recorded in the Christian New Testament. And so therefore, this defanged almost all of the most pointed arguments that de Christiani could bring in the discussion. It was a rather brilliant feint that made much of the rest of the argument, very weak. There is, by the way, a dramatization of this on YouTube, a BBC film that was made working with the transcripts of the talk, and it's really quite dramatic in general. But nevertheless, at the end of this debate, even though Nachmanides officially lost, the church was very upset with how well he performed, and so James I of Aragon rewarded Nachmanides with 300 gold coins and then said to him, "I believe you should leave Spain at this point," because essentially that's saying, I can't protect you. And so in his waning years, Nachmanides made the very arduous trip all the way to Israel, where he found a tiny, tiny surviving Jewish community there, but he was able in his last years to rebuild it, and in many ways contributed to a great renaissance in Israel. But this gives you a sense of, on the one hand, some of the strengths of the Jewish community in Catholic Spain, and also its structural weaknesses. We should also mention two other things before we move on to the story of the conversos, and that is the influence of Spanish Jews, particularly from the northern region, was quite profound throughout Europe and the Mediterranean basin. Two areas in particular are especially significant. The first is the widespread study of the Kabbalah, which had some incredible proponents in the Iberian Peninsula. We haven't had much opportunity in previous classes to talk about the Kabbalah. It is fascinating, and I hope to return to it when we come back next semester and we talk about Tzfat, because they had an explosion of Kabbalistic study there. But many of the central doctrines and, in fact, texts of the Kabbalah emanated from Spain in this place and time. The Kabbalah itself, what exactly is it? The word Kabbalah means reception or tradition. The Hebrew word lekabel means to receive, and the idea that you receive an inherited tradition and then you pass it on, relay-like. So there are ancient Kabbalistic texts that really go back many, many centuries, the Sefer Bahir and so on, and there are definitely passages in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, that are deeply Kabbalistic in nature, very mystical. But one of the most central texts of Kabbalah is believed to have originated in Spain in the 13th century, and that is the famous Zohar, or the Book of Splendor. Zahar means like to emanate in a glow kind of thing. There's a significant amount of controversy in some circles about the actual dating of the Zohar, because it is attributed to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, very important Tana of the 2nd century. But most academic scholars looking at the Sefer Zohar believe that it was actually authored in the 13th century in Spain. And there are a lot of internal literary clues as to that. The strange fact that it's not cited before this period by others, and the fact that its attribution to the ancient period was placed in doubt almost immediately after it began circulating. Although there are some who believe that it is in fact a genuine artifact of the ancient world, nevertheless, regardless of where it comes from and when it is written, it is a work of great spiritual genius, phenomenal insight into Jewish mysticism, and it was deeply inspirational throughout the entire Mediterranean basin. So that was one very strong element of kind of Spanish intellectual export from the period. Another area where the Spanish Jews exported from northern Spain was their tremendous skill at translations, especially in the region of Provence, which is not too far away from Spain, just a little bit up the coast, the south of France, where there was a very unusual Jewish community. We've spoken about it in different lectures. And one of the most exciting things that was happening there is a lot of Hebrew classics, or I should say, a lot of Judeo-Arabic classes, like the work of Maimonides, for example, was translated into Hebrew by people like the Ibn Tibbon family of translators. So they're bringing a lot of Arabic Jewish wisdom, or Jewish wisdom that's recorded in an Arabic language, to a Hebrew-speaking language, a Hebrew-speaking population, and really generating a lot of cultural ferment around these. Last thing, science. The coast of North Africa was filled with Arabic-speaking scientists, many of whom were Jews, and the primary conduit of all of that scientific information happened through those translators coming up into southern Europe in particular, Italy as well. Abraham ibn Ezra is perhaps one of the most famous of these people coming from Spain, who brought his astrolabe with him everywhere in order to explain these technologies of navigation by the stars that had a phenomenal impact on Europe afterwards. So these are the kind of things that are happening in northern Spain at this time, really dramatic and exciting, but unfortunately they would have a very tragic denouement that we're going to continue with. But with that, I want to thank you very much for your attention and your endurance, and I look forward to speaking with you soon.